was thinking a lot about what it meant to be a feminist retelling or a feminist novel. And a feminist retelling to me is kind of any radical reorientation away from the default narrative, which is patriarchy and maleness, in favor of telling stories of like marginalized groups. And I say marginalized groups and not just straight up women, right? Because I think that structures of oppression are interlocking. So anything that advances an individual group forward necessarily liberates all groups. So basically a feminist retelling reorients around a less classically powerful entity and kind of moves away from like white cis male aesthetics to focus on the inner lives and complexities of marginalized groups. So I think that's kind of like what Medea does, hopefully.
I'm so happy to be here with Eilish Quin to talk about Medea, which it's her debut novel, right?
Yes, yeah, my debut.
We're so excited to talk about it. So just to start, can you introduce us to the world of Medea and talk a little bit about your book?
So Medea tells the story of one of the most reviled and maligned women, I think, to grace the pages of Greek mythology. And her story is an incredibly ancient one. It's been told by some of the most eloquent composers, from Apollonius to Euripides. And so my interest in discussing her was less about detracting from kind of those older traditional stories and more about exploding them, just to give Medea as a protagonist the space I felt like she deserved, to be kind of like all of the things that maybe women in antiquity were slightly maligned for being. So ruthless and vulnerable and complex and resilient. All of those things.
Yeah, and I think I can say this. This is like the third Medea retelling I'm reading in the last 2 or 3 months. I'm not sure. But I really love, like, every single one has something different that makes it like unique. And I loved every single one of those, like, amazing. And I loved every single author that I've been like talking to or like reading about. I've like found a way to make it look like different in a way, like even Medea's like character is like portrayed in a different way, and it's so interesting for me to see, you know. So I want to talk about her complexity, because as you said, she's a really complex character, and so we can see a little bit of her psyche in the book. And she's like a complex character with admirable but also morally gray ambiguous traits. So I wanted to ask, like, why and what inspired you to write about her? Like, can you talk a little bit about it? Because I'm super curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as Medea's good sides and bad sides go, I think that dichotomy or that ambiguity was initially what really drew me to her. I think frequently when Medea is brought up in either writing or conversation, there's this tendency to kind of like reduce or simplify or distill her into this kind of like savage or evil or violent creature, right? She's a witch and a kinslayer. And perhaps like most perilously, she's a bad mom, right? So and there are certainly elements of her story which are difficult to grapple with. I think ancient folks had a hard time grappling with it, and modern folks do as well. And I think a part of me was very interested in inhabiting the interiority of somebody who, could be so easily characterized as either savior or siren. And I was interested in deconstructing both of those associations. And then as I wrote, I found that her story actually made a great deal of sense to me, and her interiority was wildly sympathetic and admirable, even. I think, too, sometimes, like, we forget that Medea is hardly the first character in Greek mythology to carry out acts of unspeakable violence against her family. Like, we have Hercules, Tantalus, Kronos even, right? They're all charged with murdering their children, but because mothers are like associated with the comfort and familiarity of the domestic realm, when they defy those characterizations, it's especially perilous.
How did it work for you? Like, did you, like, one day you woke up and decided, like, I want to talk about Medea? Like, how did it arrive to you? Like, the inspiration?
Yeah. So the Greek myths were some of the first stories that my mom would read to me before bed every night with my brother. And we had this like very nostalgic book of, I don't know how to pronounce it, Delares or Delaries Greek myths. It's the one with like the very cute, it's like a kid's one, orange cover with like horses pulling a sun chariot. And like from the time I was little, those stories just fascinated me. I thought they were like ruthless and exciting and kind of like poignant in a way that sometimes other stories like didn't seem to me. So it was very enticing to a child's mind. And then the actual impetus for the novel Medea was I came across this like a writing contest online for a small indie press. And basically the manuscript was due in a month. And I was like, what could I write about in a month? And I felt fairly connected to Greek mythology, and I felt like I had kind of a pretty solid understanding of it from my childhood. So I was like, okay, I'm going to write Medea. And I did. And that was the manuscript that came out of that in a month.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the feminist perspective in the book, because, you know, like Medea lives, as most retellings and most mythological female characters, lives in like patriarchal society. And before diving into it, I wanted to read a couple of annotations that I have, like not annotation, but like quotes that I found in the book that I annotated because they were just like important for me for the like feminist perspective of it. So like the first one, so the first one says, of the things that walk this earth and are sentient, woman is the most foul, and for all of her power and ambition, she was still a woman. So like, yeah. Okay. Then the second one is like a shorter one, but I felt it and was like, how humiliating it was to be a woman. Wow. And then the last one, it's something that actually she doesn't say, but someone else says that we can talk about later. And it's let's just say it's a man. And it says, I can say whatever I wish about you, and the great man of this world will listen, which means that she's not credible, you know? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this, because I think it's really important when we talk about mythological retellings that involve women. So yeah, what can you say about it?
Well, I think it's always kind of interesting to think about Medea in terms of the feminist attitudes of each like subsequent retelling. So like we have the Argonautica, right, and Apollonius, and that work kind of depicts Medea as like this peripheral love interest, and you know she's a character defined mostly in relation to how she harms or helps Jason and the Argonauts, right? And then we have Euripides, who arrives on the scene, and his decision to place Medea kind of at the center of the action, right, at the heart of the tragedy, showcasing her interiority. That's like in itself a radical reorientation, right? However uncomplimentary that might have been. And then I think when I was working on this book, I was thinking a lot about what it meant to be a feminist retelling or a feminist novel. And a feminist retelling to me is kind of any radical reorientation away from the default narrative, which is patriarchy and maleness, in favor of telling stories of like marginalized groups. And I say marginalized groups and not just straight up women, right? Because I think that structures of oppression are interlocking. So anything that advances an individual group forward necessarily liberates all groups. So basically a feminist retelling reorients around a less classically powerful entity and kind of moves away from like white cis male aesthetics to focus on the inner lives and complexities of marginalized groups. So I think that's kind of like what Medea does, hopefully.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think that gives us a lot to like reflect about. And that's also something else that I wanted to ask. So I'm just going to ask it right away. Like what themes and what, I don't know, what did you incorporate in the book that you think would help like readers, like nowadays readers, so like even teenagers or someone else, to reflect on our life, like the world we live in today. I mean, I think feminism like was one of those themes because it's important to like, you know. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah. I love that question. Like how is Medea relatable in a current context? And I would say, I think at its core, like this novel is really about what happens when you put even like the most brilliant and kind and fierce and resilient characters right into impossible situations. And I guess like a major theme would be like trauma sometimes doesn't turn us into better or stronger people. It just, you know, evacuates us of our humanity and alienates us from our humanity, which I think is super applicable, unfortunately, to so many things going on in the world today, right? Societal structures of oppression. In Medea's case, it's patriarchy and xenophobia. It has these really profound interpersonal damages on the level of the nuclear family. So Medea first is like a child and then as a woman and an outsider, right? She's constantly policed by the men around her. And And that induces a kind of madness and a kind of tragedy to her circumstances, which is very difficult to avoid. I know you live in Milan, but I think about that a lot in terms of like the US descent into fascism, or like how we handle immigration, or the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Anytime we're restricting the bodily autonomy of folks on the state level, there's really profound damages that come from that.
Since it's a retelling, I wanted to ask, like, what, like, how did you achieve the balance between the myth and the retelling? So, between the original version of it and your own version, like, what did you incorporate of your own that wasn't in the myth, and so on?
Yeah, well, I think the whole purpose of retellings as a genre are kind of like this radical reorientation, right? In some cases, it's kind of like this modernization of a really ancient and beautiful story, in the interest of kind of giving alternate characters a voice. So I think when I was writing this one, I was hoping that it would, make people think critically about kind of the narrators we're given, and also the context that give rise to certain emotions or choices in a character. I think from the outset too, I knew that I wanted Medea to be set in alignment with like the mytho-historical past from which it was derived. And I think sometimes decisions like that can theoretically limit the agency of an author, just because like there's the confines of the story that are already set out for you, right? But I actually found it kind of liberating, just because because there are these choices, you have space to move in between them. And I think hopefully I was able to project a little bit of my own feeling onto the landscape, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's always the possibility to take an old story and remove it entirely from its context and place it in a new one. There's an infinite amount of variations that could take place, and that's kind of like the wonder of writing. But I don't know, like something about like Colchis just drew me in, like the roughness of the turf, the gloom over the Valley of Phasis. Like I felt like really drawn to that location. I think probably in the same way that Medea felt subsumed into that location as well. So
also, let's talk a little bit about power and power dynamics in the book.
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about different kind of powers. So like Medea has magical abilities, but also she has power that is linked to her like social status, because she's a princess. So she has power like from her birth, but like the magical abilities that she gains, they're also like power, Right. So how do these powers, change the story, and how do they intersect with, and what message do you want it to convey with these powers? Like, because also like it's not just a myth about magic, it's also about politics and so on. So that's really well.
Yeah, I think femininity together with like the sense of being foreign or foreignness functioned in ancient Greece in much the same way that it functions in the contemporary period, which is to say it's to exist as a woman and a foreigner is to exist under this sense of constant policing, right? So, and why was she being policed? It's because she's incredibly powerful, and in that power is a sense of destabilization. There's like an instability, I think, that is like suggested in the person of Medea, and it's rendered like exponentially more perilous just by virtue of her being a mother, because that makes her like symbolically like a vessel of futurity for the Greek city-state and its values, right? So because she kind of has this like wildness in her, which is kind of a metaphor for the chaos of the natural world that she's able to harness, and she's also kind of standing in for like the carefully constrained realm of the familiar and the domestic, as a mother, I think that renders her particularly terrifying to the powers that be, especially those dependent on patriarchy and hierarchy. So yeah, I think it's really hard to divorce Medea from like the social or political context that she's emerging from. Yeah.
And since we're talking about her, I wanted to like discuss a little bit also her like evolution throughout the story, because since I've been reading all these Medea like variants, the common denominator for me is like how much she suffers. It's like, it's so sad,
right?
But yeah, like she goes from being just a witch when she grows up and a princess, like actually go on a journey, discover new places, new people, and that's really interesting. But like she undergoes an actual change in herself, also because of all the pain that she has to endure, you know?
Exactly.
So, yeah, can we talk about it?
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant question. I think so much of Medea is consistent. Intriguingly enough, I think this becomes obfuscated by the tumult and the tragedy of her situation, right? But so many of her core qualities remain the same throughout the novel, right? So her brilliance, her resourcefulness, her devotion to making sure that the people she loves are kept safe, right? Those elements of her character, I feel like they don't change too overwhelmingly. But as her mental health deteriorates, there's a certain degree of shifting in how she interacts with others and how she presents herself. So she can be ruthless, she can be manipulative when she needs to be, but I feel like this comes about like out of necessity. So I think like maybe the true dynamism of the story has to do with how characters learn to forgive themselves and others for their own inherent monstrosity in the context of like really impossible situations. So like I feel like the biggest shift in Medea probably is less about like the development of her pragmatism, although that is important, but like in her ability to accept love and forgiveness from those around her, even when she doesn't necessarily feel fit to bestow that grace on herself.
I think there's also like the change in her, like the development in her character is also like has a huge effect, like an impact on her like ambiguous morality, because she does some things that can be questioned. For example, like spoiler alert, like the death of her children. It's just it's always like so ruthless to read about it, and I mean it happens in the story, so we have to talk about it. And do you think like when you were writing it, I mean, because I know that it's a retelling, but it's also your story that you're telling because it's what you wanted to write. Do you think she actually felt like she could revive them, or she knew that she couldn't and she did it anyways because that's...
That's such an interesting question. That's an interesting question. I think inherent to that act of violence where you're killing something is the knowledge that they are going to come back changed. Even in the best case scenario, they're alive, but there's that kind of darkness leaves a mark somewhere, right? So regardless of whether the children lived or not, I think she was sacrificing an aspect of them for a sense of liberation on her part, which I think that's hard to analyze. But at the same time, like I actually, when I wrote the ending, it had a different ending originally. The children lived. Like when I first wrote this, children lived. And my agent at the time, and she was right. She was like, "No, I think we should change this up." So actually, like in my perfect world, like the kids were fine.
Okay, so they would undergo the same process that her brother underwent, you know?
Yeah. I think it's like sometimes you have to be pragmatic, and I think she realized the only way that they would have a good life was if they were away from kind of the abuses and control of their father. So it's tricky. It's a tricky thing to balance.
Yeah, that's so interesting, like to hear it from you, because it's your perspective as a writer, and I think that's amazing. And I think I'm really lucky to actually have this confrontation, you know, because not everyone that reads a book can talk to the author, you know, and it's amazing. I'm so happy.
Well, I'm loving it. Yeah, it's like that's such an interesting question.
Yeah, I was wondering it because, you know, I have a lot of questions in my mind when I read a book. It's just like exploding. So yeah.
When you read it, feel like she was kind of expecting them not to come back, or what did it feel like when you were reading it? Do you feel like she kind of knew in some way?
I felt like she was like really hoping that they would come back, but she was not sure, because also like her brother was telling her like, you cannot be sure about this. So I think even if she really, really hoped with all the strength she had in her, like a little part of her knew that it could go
There's
wrong.
always potential for error, although hope is such a strong thing. It's like a beautiful thing and a blanket
but I feel like I mean, she kind of saved them from Jason, but at the same time destroyed them. So I mean, it's like another pain that she has to endure, like another, suffering that she can add to all the others that she's had in her life. So
yeah, it's brutal. Yeah, I think short answer, I think she was hoping that her children would come back. I think you're right. Yeah, I think she thought they would, but
yeah, like you can see from like how destroyed she was afterwards when she arrives in, I think, Athens, and she's like with the dead bodies of her children with her, it's like destroying.
Oh, I think it's one thing to anticipate possibility, and it's another thing to live it. So yeah, like that must have been so horrifying. I can't even imagine.
This question is like more bibliographical, if I can say that. I want to ask about your research that you put in the book, because when you write a retelling, you have to research a lot of things and incorporate like historical facts and, environments and whatever in the book. So how did the research go for you? Like, what did you have to research?
So I want to preface this with a really quick kind of like general thing, which is one of the truly marvelous things about being a writer is that everything you do, no matter how big or how small, any experience, either pleasurable or traumatizing, that can be research in your writing. It can go into your work at some point. So something as like subtle as a feeling you have, or as rigorous as like scanning JSTOR for academic articles, right? All of that can be research, and everything in between, just because everything kind of can play a role in your work eventually. So when I started writing this book, I felt like pretty solid about like my understanding of Greek mythology, although I feel like, every time I return to those stories, they're just like so stunning and gleaming and burnished. Like I'm just reminded of how complex and clever they are, just because like everyone and everything is connected with this sort of like ineffable precision. But I think, so I kind of went in with an understanding of that, but I did have to do quite a bit of research on planetary herbalism and plant magic. And some of that I got from my undergrad years. I did a lot of like research into ancient Cretan mythologies and like dead languages, and I department hopped quite a bit. And I also kind of had to draw a lot from different primary source materials and like academic articles. And then like one of the coolest things that I got to do is I took some classes with this really great occult bookstore in New York called Catlin Books, which is subsequently closed, which is like tragic. But that was really cool because I got to like engage and learn from like contemporary witches who were willing to show me something of the ropes. So I think like in order to craft Medea's understanding of pharmacon, or like the double-edged blade of plant magic, I had to kind of try to attempt this alchemical fusion that honored kind of like the rituals of, long ago, but also felt intuitively true to my own kind of like philosophy of magical practice. And I kind of like to think, like, this might sound a little wishy-washy, I kind of like to think that I was like sort of like channeling Medea too, and like she was kind of telling me what she wanted, and I hope so. Hopefully this is like, in alignment with anything that she would have hoped for.
That's so interesting. Now, let's talk a little bit about the relationship dynamics between Medea and the other characters. I feel like maybe the most important are like Jason and her brother, because I feel like the bond between her and her brothers is like very strong, which is like very nice. I love when like these relationships exist that are not just lovers, it's like more.
Yeah.
And there's like something about that her brother says that was like a stab in the back. I think it's when at the end he basically tells her that she is exactly like her father. He says it, and we know how much he actually loves her, so double the pain. But it says a lot about what's going on with Medea in her life and how she has changed. Like, she starts saying something like there's like a part at the beginning of the book, kind of the beginning, when she says that she has understood that she wants her father dead, and then she becomes just like him. So that's interesting, because we can see how the dynamics have changed, and apart from that, also the dynamic with Jason, it's important because it kind of shapes her. And if we talk about it, we can also talk about prophecies, because I think everything is like laid out for them. Like, it's not something they can choose. But there's also like when we talk about Jason and Medea, we can talk about prophecies, so like what the gods want them to be and what the gods want them to do. But is there something more, like something about like from their own will, you know?
So that's interesting about like fate versus free will. Yeah. Well, I'll start with that quote where Phaethon is saying that she's like her father. Yeah, I think part of that is like, I think sometimes when we're really upset or we're in these moments of really heightened emotion, sometimes we say like the most hurtful thing that we can possibly land upon and not mean them. Because I think like, I think he knows too that her greatest fear on some level is maybe replicating the abuse that she faced in her life, and like the extent that, you know, Aedes inflicted damage on his children, she's worried about replicating that cycle and inflicting violence on her children, which she ultimately does, but I think for very different reasons. And so I think for her motivations are what separates her from Aedes. There is like a difference, and I think Phaethon knows that, but I think he's almost like trying to warn her or like jolt her out of this like space of uncertainty or kind of like muddling, because she's not like strictly rational at the point in the story where she's having this discussion with him, right? Her relationship with him was really interesting, because originally when I set out to write this story, I assumed it was going to be a story about motherhood, just because of I just read the Euripides version, and so much of that is kind of about motherhood, even though the kids are kind of like peripheral characters in Euripides. But actually it ended up being, I think, mostly a book about sibling bonds. I think like the bond between Medea and Phaethon like pretty much overshadows the bond between Jason and Medea as well. And I did that a little bit intentionally, just because I was hoping that maybe the positive relationship elements would outweigh kind of like the abusive negative dynamics that exist in her life. In the sense that like love champions over violence and abuse every time. But yeah, her relationship with Jason is interesting. I think they feel very drawn to each other because they both sense in the other some of the evil at their own centers, or what they perceive as evil. I think Jason is properly evil and Medea is not. But I think she sees in him this reflection of what she imagines herself to be. And that creates a sort of gravity between them, which is very unfortunate.
Like, you could have chosen to like when I was reading it, I was waiting for you to like give an excuse for her actions, like, you know, she's doing this because she's forced or whatever. But actually you left in a way a side of her that it's still morally gray, which I appreciated immensely, because we all are a little bit, you know.
Yeah,
it's not, and we're not perfect, and I feel like I really, really like that. So thank you.
And yeah, I think moral grayness is not necessarily a bad thing. Like acknowledging the complexity of a situation or a person, that's not necessarily like a moral evil. Sometimes that's necessary. So yeah, Medea's a queen.
Yeah, slay, literally. And yeah, so I think this was important to discuss, because like, I mean, I feel like men throughout her life are really important in bad or good ways, and Jason is one of the bad ones. I feel like, yeah, but she actually encounters even good ones, and one is of course her brother. Even if she starts off not being so happy about him being born at the beginning, it's just like because of the refusal like from her mother, but that everything makes sense at the end, so it's fine. And I really like how it's kind of like forced to take care of him, and how like he gives back because they take care of each other throughout their lives, and it's super nice. So I love that.
That's an interesting way to think about it, is she cares for him in his younger days, and then when she starts to kind of really need him, he's there. I like that.
Because like in all other Medeas, like he dies for real. Like, there is no reviving. But I think that's nice that we could have him as an actual character, like speaking and living with her in this book. So I liked it.
Yeah, I think that was like also part of why I wanted to write this book, is because like as I was thinking about the story, like that element didn't make sense to me. I'm like, if she is the most powerful witch like in this period, how is it that she's not able to resurrect those that she cares about, right? So I think like the idea that necromancy never figures into the original mythology, like kind of struck me as odd. So I was like, maybe there's something more to this story that could be explored.
Yeah. And one other relationship that I loved in the book was the one with, I don't know how you pronounce it, but like here we pronounce it Circe, like the aunt.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's so cool. Oh, I love that pronunciation. Never heard that before. That's beautiful.
Really? How'd you say it?
Cersei.
Cersei, okay, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I love when they go to see her and she's helpful, but she's also like, oh, I wouldn't have recognized you, but like, I know you're my like niece, and like, I love that encounter so much because like she gives something of herself to Medea, like as a witch, and I love that. That was really nice. Did it happen for real, or was it something you decided?
So in the original mythology, I believe they do end up coming aground on Circe's island. And that is where they're kind of like cleansed and purified after the initial murder of Absyrtus or Phaethon, her brother. I changed certain elements of it just because Phaethon's not actually dead, but they still needed to be cleansed or purified. And I made it kind of like a marriage ceremony for Jason and Medea. I think also I was really interested in the family dynamic and kind of the insights that maybe Circe could offer Medea about her own upbringing by way of characterizing her father. So like Circe has insight into Aedes that Medea doesn't have. And so kind of having this information about like maybe what drove the wedge between those siblings was a puzzle piece she was missing in her own mind about why he like hates women so much and is like, you know, so terrible to her. So yeah, it was supposed to be kind of almost like a weird like bit of exposition that you didn't know you needed.
No, that was so nice. I loved reading about it. And also because we don't know anything about Aeetes, like as we see through Medea's perspective. But like thanks to Circe, we do, and it's really helpful for the story to like develop in our minds as well. So I liked it.
I think it also offers a little bit of a foil to like her and Phaethon's dynamic, because you see like what happens when their sister dynamic goes really wrong versus like what happens when you stick together and there's that unconditional love. So
yeah, no, that parallel was really good because I thought about it as well when I was reading it, so it worked. I can assure you. So this question is one that I always ask to every author, and I love doing this because it's fun. So can you tell us a little bit about maybe like reviews that you've received since the book has been out? If there were like some odd ones, some funny ones, or even like some like maybe reviews that you were not expecting, or if you maybe got the response that you were expecting.
Oh, I love that question. I think it's brilliant. So I know a lot of authors like just like steer clear of Goodreads because it's like this very stressful event. But I compulsively read all my Goodreads reviews because I'm just like so curious. And I think there was a period in my life where I was so afraid of showing anyone my writing. I like guarded everything I wrote with like this incurable fervency. Because there's something like very safe and sacred about writing just for yourself, but also I'm enjoying kind of like this idea of writing for others. But yeah, so the reviews I've received, there's positive and negative ones, and then there's ones in the middle. I think I have a little bit of imposter syndrome, so I have a hard time believing like when it's like a 5-star, I'm like, okay, I don't know about that. Or if it's like a 1-star though, I'm kind of like, that's extreme. Like, I don't know about that. But then if it's like a 3-star review, you're like, oh, they read it. They know you. They've like psychoanalyzed you as an author. They know everything. So those are kind of like the most like dramatic ones, but also the most interesting ones. But yeah, I've received a bunch of reviews that like I've screenshotted because I just think they're incredible. Like even if they're negative, I think they're incredible. Like someone called me a budget Jane Austen, and I was like, that is the highest compliment I've ever received. Like actually, like I know they didn't mean it as one, but I was like, that's so nice. Yeah, I don't know. I also just like I love reviews because it's a great way to improve as an author. Like you learn what other people like and don't like, but it's also a way of moderating your own regulative capacities because like you're never going to please everybody. So kind of finding like this sense of like inner peace with your own work or like satisfaction with your own work, like that's something that I think I have to work on, and it's something that's fun to work on with all of the readers. I love every review I've gotten, even the super negative ones. They all have something to offer.
No, yeah, I think reviews are really helpful. Like, if I were a writer, I would read them. Like, I wouldn't, I couldn't stop myself. I would have to read.
Yeah, because you're like, oh, and sometimes,
if
you get it and you're like, yeah, that's true. You're like, yeah.
No, but like, if you read them with the right mindset and you don't let them put you down, I feel like you can learn from them. So
yeah,
they're kind of good.
Much.
Yeah. Also, like, I don't know if you can give me an answer for this, but I wanted to ask, do you know if it's coming out in Italy?
I hope so. I think I was talking to my publisher, and I think they're working on international rights right now. So hopefully, fingers crossed, because that'd be really cool. Yeah.
When like, so most of the books I read are not Italian. So
yeah,
it's always like a question for me, because I wanted to see the book in my country, and people because like a lot of people do not read in English here. So for me, when I want to talk about a book and no one has read it, it's like, I cannot have someone to discuss it with. So when it comes out in Italy, like, it's amazing for me,
because translation is such an art, and like when you have a brilliant translator, it I don't know, it like elevates the work too, because they kind of leave their own distinct like taste on it, and it's like it's like this beautiful collaboration. So if it ever did get translated, I would.
So do you plan on writing more about mythology, or was it just like, it's just Medea and that's it for you?
I love retellings. There's so many retellings I want to do. I have one I've been thinking about that maybe is like a sapphic retelling of Clytemnestra and Cassandra, just because I feel like it'd be kind of fun. Yeah. So I've been thinking about that. I really want to. I don't know, Iphigenia has always really interested me as well. But I think right now I'm not working on retellings, just because I've had some other projects in the pipeline. So I'm currently working on a sci-fi novella, and then also it's like this detective LA Gothic steeped in Irish folklore. So it's two separate projects, but they're both very different from retellings. So hopefully they'll go okay.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they will. Thank you so much. I really appreciated talking to you. No, yeah, I loved it. You're such an amazing person. I think you're brilliant. You're amazing.
I think you're brilliant and amazing. And I just your questions are wonderful. Everything you've put out so far with other authors, brilliant. So